Well, welcome to episode 4 of First Look, Alder Community Church's podcast to help you get prepared for what is coming up. And we are jumping into a brand new series in the book of Esther called Where is God? And I'm having a conversation today with Pastor Steve Brooks, pastor of missions and outreach. And he's also who is going to be opening this series for us here. And we have a great conversation around the book of Esther, the first 2 chapters, cover all kinds of stuff. We get into a little bit of theology about God's sovereignty, which was awesome. We get into some questions around how we deal with really hard things, and Esther invites us into that as well. So I hope you enjoy this and that it gets you ready for what God is teaching us as a church. Let's go. Steve, thank you so much for joining us, and I've been looking forward to getting you in the room for a conversation. This is going to be a fun one. And for those who don't know, you actually are kicking off this new series that we're in. And so this is going to help people get prepared for the very first message in our Esther series. And that's what you're going to be teaching. And we are calling this series in the book of Esther, Where is God? And you're going to help us maybe understand that a little bit in the beginning. But so let's talk about that. Why are we calling this series Where is God?
Well, just real quick before I answer that, I'm super excited to be back in the Old Testament. I just love Old Testament books. But it's so appropriate for that book because people who might be familiar with the book know it's one of 2 books in the Bible that never mentions God. He's not mentioned anywhere.
Yeah. And it's not like, it doesn't mention God, but it like, uses a different name or whatever. Like, God is straight up never mentioned. Miracles are never mentioned. The covenant is never mentioned. Yep. The law is never mentioned. Essentially all the classic Jewish things are basically absent in this book.
He is conspicuous by his absence.
Yeah.
And if you're familiar and you've been reading through the Old Testament, all those things that you just mentioned, you've been reading book after book after book, they just suddenly disappear.
Yeah. So why is that? Did they just forget? Is that
I think part of what we're trying to see in this, and it's obviously very appropriate for a time in which we're living too, is sometimes it's really hard to see God. Yeah. I mean, in our lives, we don't have a narrator in the back of our head, aside from the times the Holy Spirit says that was God. A lot of times We're just wondering, where is he? What's he doing?
You missed that red light because you were going to get into a car accident. Yeah, there's no voice explaining to us God. And so, I mean, what you're getting at is important for people to realize. The fact that God is absent is an intentional decision by the author. It is intentionally avoiding using the term, and what it does is it invites you to have to look.
Yep. And that's something we do in our own lives. We're invited to do in our own lives. Sure, there's those times where the Lord shows up sort of miraculously. I have a few examples, but most of the time we're called to search, to look, to pray, to seek.
Yeah. And what's really interesting about that is even for followers of Jesus, you can be in a season of life where honestly you're kind of ignorant to what God is up to. You're not thinking about what God's up to. You're not asking him to work in any particular way. Like, you're just living your life totally in the dark to what God is doing. And I think what this is doing is it's inviting us to not live that way, right? It's inviting us to be people who say, okay, what is God up to? And so every week in the story, we're going to ask that question as we read through the story of Esther. Where do we see God at work in this? And hopefully that's going to be something that trains us to do that in our own lives as well. Yeah,
and this first couple chapters is really conspicuous with God's absence because looking for God is particularly hard here. It's a pretty dark couple of chapters.
Yeah. So your first sermon is covering chapters 1 and 2.
Yep.
And let's just walk through that a little bit. So, we set up the story and we are in Persia.
Yep.
King Xerxes is in power. And the very first scene is this elaborate banquet, right? Where the wine stewards are told, let them drink as much wine.
Open bar.
With no restrictions. And so you can kind of picture this, royal palace rager, essentially. And that's where the story opens. And what do you think as the reader, what do you think we're supposed to be getting from this opening?
It's been really interesting, just reading it several times, getting ready for the message. Like, when you first look at it, it's kind of glitzy. I'm picturing this palace and this super powerful leader. And then you start thinking about what would it be like if everybody could have as much as they wanted to drink and they're all sloppy drunk.
And they're powerful. And I mean, it's a bad combination.
It's a bad situation. You don't have to read or think long to realize this could go wrong, and is probably going wrong in a whole lot of ways.
Yeah. And so that party ends where the king, drunk and wanting to show off for his buddies, tells his Queen Vashti, to come display her beauty for everyone to see. And what does that mean?
Little controversy there, but a lot of the older historical records would indicate that she was being requested to walk in front of these guys without a stitch of clothing on.
Yeah.
So it's pretty...
It did say that he was willing to let her wear the crown.
Yes, at least he was kind enough to let her wear the crown.
And the other thing is, like, it's not like she is just... hanging out in her room doing nothing. She's actually putting on her own banquet at the time. So it's like, leave your banquet and come be, this spectacle at mine. And she says no.
Yep. She's a puppet. She's being treated like a puppet, like an object. And, it's interesting. In a lot of ways, you could argue she's certainly one of the heroes of the story. She said, I'm not going to subject myself to that indignity.
Yep. And so, I mean, saying no to the king is bad enough. But also to do it publicly, like, this is a big deal. And so they all get together. They decide that she's out of there. She's actually probably very lucky not to have been killed.
And she may have been killed. We don't entirely know.
That's true. And so suddenly there's a need for a new queen. Yep. And that's what gets us introduced to Esther's story. So Esther is a Jew. She's living among the Jews who are in exile in Persia.
Yep.
And what we're told is that she is taken... That word is ambiguous a little bit. It is, yeah. But she's taken to the palace where she is one of many girls. The text would say women, but these are
virgins.
Young girls.
Is what the text explicitly says, which is an important word, because just to add a little color here, and again, this isn't evident at first glance, she's probably 14 or 15 years old.
Yeah.
Which is pretty staggering, because I have a 13-year-old and a 17-year-old daughter at home, and it's pretty hard to imagine that.
Yep. And so this whole group of girls is taken to the palace and prepared for their one night with the king.
Wait, isn't that a Christian movie?
They did make a movie called One Night with the King. Maybe we will get to how horrendous that is.
What's that rated?
I don't know. So this is the world that we're being introduced here in these first two chapters, and it is brutal. I mean, Christians try to kind of dance around this. Like, I remember the VeggieTales version of this story was like a talent show, right? Basically, and often these stories, it's presented as if this is this great honor. The girls are like, it's like they saw a flyer, like, looking for a new queen, come try out, or
realize
whatever.
Your dreams.
Yeah, and it's portrayed that way, and that is, I would probably go so far as to say wildly off base. Like, Esther wants to be with her family. She's an orphan. She's living with her uncle. She wants to live with her people. She wants to get married. She wants to have a family and a life. This is being completely snatched out of that, and that is all taken from her. Yep. She is never going to be with her family again. She's going to be a part of the king's harem. She's forced into a sexual relationship with this evil pagan ruler. And I think where we need people to start in the book of Esther is to at least just look eye to eye with the reality of the evil in this story.
The evil is lurking just below the surface. You don't have to dig real far. It's there, and we overlook it to our peril. Yeah.
And I think part of the reason why we kind of sugarcoat it is because we're uncomfortable.
Yep.
It's hard to think about a teenage girl. I mean, we have a word for this in our culture. It's called rape.
Yep.
Right? When you're forced into a sexual relationship that you do not want to be a part of. And I think it gives us some pause, because there's also this aspect where it's like, okay, this is in the Bible. This is in some sense a positive story about what God is doing. What are we supposed to learn from this? I think it makes us uncomfortable, and some people might even ask, like, okay, like, is God okay with this?
Well, just to camp on the sort of appalling nature of it for a second, one of the really interesting things I read leading up to this was an Orthodox Jewish author. And she wanted to dig into her heritage, and she wanted to read a story to her kids. So she got a picture book of Esther and starts reading it to her kids, thinking it's going to be just completely safe and innocent. And her 7-year-old goes, wait, isn't she sleeping with a man who isn't her husband? I mean, the 7-year-old picks up on it.
Yes.
So It gets a lot worse from there, actually. But yeah.
Yeah. So, and this is another aspect of the book on the whole. I mean, this book has sex, murder, something that would border on genocide.
Yeah.
I mean, drunkenness. I mean, just on and on. And so there's a lot of moral ambiguity in this book. And you know, I don't know if you ever hear people talk about this, but they talk about how I can't believe Christians think the Bible is this moral teaching that's supposed to help us be moral people. Don't you know the Bible has XYZ, statutory rape, murder, genocide?
It's rated R, man.
Like, I hope that nobody's actually using the Bible as their moral framework.
Yeah.
And so a book like this is kind of easy fodder for that. Help people understand why that's a bad argument.
I mean, one of the things that you have to reckon with is the whole thing reads a lot like headlines, but you're looking for the commentary or the editorial with the headlines. You want God to speak up and say, now this is really bad.
Right.
So
it's one thing if the Bible has something bad in it, as long as the Bible also says, by the way, this is a bad thing.
Yeah.
And Esther never does that.
God is reporting, the biblical writers are reporting, but not necessarily endorsing what they're reporting.
Okay, that is huge. We gotta say that again. This is so helpful to know how to read your Bible, especially the Old Testament. Something the Bible records is not necessarily something the Bible endorses.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that the Bible does not shy away from the harsh realities of the world that we live in. It doesn't sugarcoat it, and it doesn't just pull God's people out of it as though we're removed from it altogether.
Yes.
We live in it.
And also, at the same time, something that the Bible records positive characters doing is not something that necessarily the Bible endorses. We read the Bible, especially the Old Testament, almost like Aesop's fables.
Yep.
Where like this is the picture of the moral person that we're supposed to emulate. In all the Bible stories, God is the picture that we're supposed to emulate. Or Jesus is the picture that we're supposed to emulate. Every person, whether they're a good character or a bad character, is presented as a flawed person. So something that Esther does, just because the book is named after her, doesn't necessarily mean that it's good.
Like sleeping with a man who's not your husband.
Yeah.
Or even, I mean, you could ask, couldn't she have protested like Vashti protested? Wouldn't that have been the godly thing? Wouldn't she have been more of a hero, said, I'm not going to stand for this? I mean.
And we're left to wonder.
Yeah.
The Bible, that story doesn't make a moral judgment. It just is recording the story, and we're left to kind of sort through it. And I think that's a legitimate question. I think at the same time, we have to recognize that much of this is outside of her control. I mean,
she's 14.
She's a teenager. She's being taken by powerful men to a place she doesn't want to go, to be in a sexual relationship with a powerful man. Like, she is, in my mind, my guess is she is crying herself to sleep at night.
Yep.
And she is horrified at what is going on.
Well, let's extend this to Mordecai, who's also kind of considered to be a hero in the story. One of the things we find out about Mordecai pretty early on is he kindly raised her as his own daughter. She did not have her parents. We don't know how she lost them. But then he instructs her, don't tell anybody you're a Jew.
Right.
In such contradiction to so many other places, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach.
Yeah.
I mean, shouldn't he have said, let's stand up for God, for God's people? No, he says, shush.
So you have these other stories in the Bible of the same time period, the same issues.
Yep.
And, we have the famous story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, being told to bow down to the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. They say no. And they have the famous line, like, God is able to save me from this, but even if he doesn't, I'm botching it, but essentially, like, I'm willing to be killed for this.
I'm willing to die.
And they get thrown into the furnace, and God delivers them. And it's this awesome story of, like, you can stand up for the right thing, and God's a God who can deliver you from it. And then we have Esther, where it's essentially exactly the opposite. It's hide who you are, don't protest. And God uses that too, and it's super interesting.
And she'll have her moment, of course.
Will.
We're only in the first couple of chapters, but you wonder if she couldn't have done more early on.
Yeah. So the series is called Where is God? And this week we're staring evil face to face. I mean, this is as bad as it gets.
It's brutal.
And we got to ask our question. So where is God in this? You're going to teach this. You're going to help us think as followers of Jesus. Where is God when evil seems to be winning? When we're suffering? When everything's going terribly? Esther certainly is in that situation in these first two chapters. And so as we're wanting to be people who look at this and say, okay, what is God up to? How do we do that in these first couple chapters?
Well, I have to confess, one of the temptations, even in preparing the message, is I just kept wanting to jump to the end of the book. Because, a lot of people will know it already anyway, and you want to get to the happy part, you want to get to the good part, but we can't jump there without feeling the tension and the pain of wondering, where is God when I'm in the middle of living this, especially as a 14 or 15-year-old girl.
I mean, we want to do that when we read a story like this. We also want to do that in our own lives.
Right now.
Right. I mean, how many people just want to fast forward past 2020 and just get me past this election, these debates, get me past all this, and yet that's not how life works.
And I think so many of us obviously are deeply feeling that right now. Just that cloudy murkiness. Where is God in all this? It doesn't look like it's going in a real good direction. Certainly not for the church and God's people.
Yep.
So where is God? And we got to feel that pain and that tension to really appreciate what's going on.
Yeah. And then, I mean, you look outside of our current time, and this might be a season where many of us are feeling that, but I think all of us, unrelated to the culture around us, have seasons of life where for us personally, it is not going well. I mean, there are going to be people who hear this conversation who have experienced firsthand what Esther is going through, who have experienced sexual abuse, who have experienced abandonment, have experienced, the list goes on and on and on. And for all of us, there's times where we're in the valley. And so, where is God in that?
It's really hard when someone asks you that, especially when, they have been abused.
Yeah.
It's very personal. It's them. And so those are really tricky questions that you and I both know theologians have wrestled with for a long time. Christians have wrestled with for a long time. What do you think, Wyatt?
I told you could turn it on me if you wanted to. Yeah, I mean, I think, let's start with the story. So we don't see anything in chapters 1 and 2 about how God's at work here. But we do know, once we read the whole rest of the story, that even though what's going on in 1 and 2 is terrible, God does end up using that for good. He does end up using Esther to deliver his whole people in Persia. He ends up using Esther's position to save her uncle's life. And now, God could have done that a number of other ways, but he actually used the fact that Esther was taken from her family and forced into the palace to accomplish that. And so we see that even though it's not easy to see now, God is at work to redeem these negative things. I think when we look at our own lives, I think one of the things that I would hope is that we could be people who have faith that even when we can't see it, God is at work to redeem the terrible, broken things in our life. And this is where we're going to get sticky in the conversation because, sometimes people say, well, God did this for a reason. And I'm not comfortable with that. I don't want to say God did this, but God will use this, right? The Romans 8:28, that God works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purposes. Not necessarily that he is behind all things, and this is me speaking, but that he will work all things together for good. And ultimately, for followers of Jesus, the promise of that is the gospel itself, is the resurrection, right? That
absolutely.
The same way that Jesus died, and yet that wasn't the end of the story, that God brought him back to life, he offers that to us too. So even if we never see a single thing turn around in this life, we know that God is healing the brokenness of our world and offers us life that goes beyond the grave.
And I, on the other hand, am a little more comfortable, and we've talked about this, as we wrestle with God and who he is and how he reveals himself in Scripture and in our lives, I'm more comfortable saying that God works through evil, not with evil, not in spite of evil, but through evil. And, obviously we see that in Jesus. Jesus entered head on into crucifixion, ultimate suffering, all the things that he took on for us as part of God's foreordained plan. Mm-hmm. How all that works in connection with things like human free will and human responsibility, I can't ultimately sort out. But the scriptures certainly seem to point me, I feel, in that direction.
Yeah, so this is kind of where I want to turn the conversation here towards the end, because I think this is one example that brings up this concept theologically that we all have to wrestle with, which is, to what degree is God involved in all the things in our life? But it comes up particularly around suffering, evil, like
Right.
when somebody I love dies in a car accident, when I lose my job, just on and on, when we get that diagnosis, how do I think about God in those details? And this is where the question of sovereignty comes up.
Yeah.
And for people who aren't familiar with the term, sovereignty is describing God's power in the world, right? His, as the king, the sovereign, to what degree does he exercise control over the universe? And Christians are all over the map on this. But let's talk about maybe the range here. And Steve, I'll turn it to you first. So, for many believers, and many people will have heard this, they believe that God is in control of everything, and more than that, he is the ultimate determining cause behind everything. And theologically, this is called meticulous sovereignty. It's the idea that every single aspect of our universe, every atom, every decision, every seeming coincidence, there is no such thing as luck. God meticulously controls every detail of the world. And Steve, I think that's something that you would be behind.
I think I'm pretty comfortable with it. And the good news is we have like 4 minutes left, and we got plenty of time to solve this. So, I think about, I forget what the Old Testament story is. One of the Old Testament kings, the prophet says, you're going to be killed in this battle. And so he decides to linger back. And it literally says, I think the NIV says, one of the opposing soldiers randomly shot an arrow, and it went through the smallest little hole in his armor and killed him, know. And God was in control of the wind and the flight and the direction and the trajectory of that arrow. So he does control down to the minutest detail.
Yes.
Where we find ourselves quickly then is, do my choices have any meaning at all? That's, I think, one of the things that's
one
often brought
question.
up.
And I think, in the context of the book of Esther and this concept of suffering, that ends up putting you in a spot where you have to say, this happened to Esther because God chose it to happen to Esther. Like the terrible thing that is going on in your life, God decided that it would take place that way before the beginning of time. He determined it. And so if that's the case, then we need to see that there is some good purpose behind it, right? There is, God has a reason. We may not know what it is, but in some way, God has a good purpose behind whatever evil suffering you're going through.
A book like Job, for me, is really helpful there. Job never even has a clue of what's going on. We know that Satan comes. You get into really tricky words like God's permissive will. He allows Satan to do what he does, but Satan can't do anything without God saying yes or no. But in the end, he doesn't ultimately answer Job's question about why did you do this to me. He just wows Job with the fact that he knows a little bit more than Job knows.
Yes.
And that's, in the end, satisfies Job, probably assumedly more than any answer we could give would do.
And so, Stephen, that's why in your counseling sessions, when somebody's going through a hard time, you just say, look, God chose this, get over it.
That's what I do. And I don't say it nearly that kind of way. I mean, once they're crying, I really chew them out. No.
Do you believe God's good or not?
I think one of the things that's really helpful for me in the conversation, too, is that it's really important, I think, to distinguish between God's will in terms of what he ordains and how he's sovereign, and God's revealed will in terms of what he intends. God doesn't intend people to abuse children. God doesn't intend murder or genocide. God's revealed will is that we would love one another, that we would love him, that we would thrive. So you have to distinguish, in a sense, between those two. And I think we often blur the lines. When we say the word God's will, we're actually looking at two different aspects.
That's really important. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why I'm not in the camp that you're in on this. I mean, I just have a hard time distinguishing those two. So you're saying that God, his desire is that we would be people who reflect his love to the world. And we agree with this, right? Like that we would be the hands and feet of Jesus. We would love, we would not harm. Like that's God's desire. In a true sense of the word, he wants that. And yet at the same time, but he decided that we wouldn't do that. We would do this other thing that is terrible and evil. And that's where I'm just like, what? I mean,
And there's so many verses in the Bible that just point to this tension between like free will and sovereignty. You know, I mean, just a few that come to mind, right? Like in the New Testament in Philippians, where Paul says, "Work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you."
Yeah.
Or there's a proverb that says, you know, the plans belong to a man, but the reply belongs to the Lord. I mean, your plans, your intentions do belong to you. You're responsible, but God ultimately controls the out. I mean, we could books this big. The thing I'm confident and I know for sure is that it's God's will that you're going to come to see that I'm right on this. So, I mean, we're good.
Or I never had a hope of doing it because God decided I wouldn't, you know? And so somewhere here, there's a mystery between the way that God's will operates in the world and the way that our will operates in the world. There's a mystery of how is it that we have true free will, which, by the way, many meticulous sovereignty people don't actually believe that we have true free will. They have free will in the sense that God doesn't force us to do something against our will,
right?
But not in the sense that we have libertarian free will, and this is getting complicated now, but libertarian free will essentially is not a political thing. It is that you really have the ability to choose between A and B.
Yeah.
And people who hold meticulous sovereignty typically actually don't believe that that is the case, that it feels like you have the choice between A and B, but really the decision is determined beforehand. And anyways, that is maybe a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I've been making you defend yourself. I'll have to at least posit some alternative rather than just throw stones at yours. I think when I think about sovereignty and the way God operates in the world, rather than me conceiving of that, and this is not just me thinking, I mean, when I read the scriptures and see what it's saying, it's true about God, is how God works in the world. It's not necessarily that God controls every last decision. He determines every outcome, every action of someone's heart. It's that he has the power to do that. His sovereignty means that there are no restrictions on God's will. Whatever he wants, he does.
Yep.
No one is above him. No one interferes with him. He is able to do and accomplish anything he wants to do and accomplish. But I do actually believe that he created us in his image with the ability to make real choices, and that he has created a universe in which human beings are able to make decisions that have real consequences in the world that are not ultimately God's, he's not the ultimate cause behind them, other than the fact that he created us and created the world that we live in with the ability to do it. And so here's why that's important, is because when somebody you love dies in a car accident, and let's make this even a little bit more clear cut.
Right.
When a drunk driver kills somebody that you love, it's the difference between saying, God did this, and God created a human being who was able to make terrible choices, and his sin caused this terrible thing to exist in the world. And yet, God, in control of all things, will miraculously work to bring good out of it, even though it's terrible. And that is still hard to believe. But I don't know, for me, I just sleep better at night thinking that God is not the one behind the terrible evil in the world.
And I can endorse both things you just said. God, in a sense, caused it, and God also created that person with a free will to get drunk and cause and wreak that havoc. I guess the flip side of it might be, you know, if something like that happens to me, and I don't believe that God oversees any and every event, then I'm kind of left wondering, why me? Like, did I just lose in the lottery and God's helpless to stop this kind of stuff?
Yeah, and that's where there is some real danger, potentially, in my view, is that it actually means that chance is a real thing. Where in meticulous sovereignty, you'd say there really is no chance God picked everything beforehand. When you say that God's sovereignty just means he does whatever he wants, but he created a world in which people's choices have consequences, there are some things that really are chance. Now, the end is not chance, because God has determined how the story ends and has the power to make it that way, and will. So it's not that everything's up to chance, but it's just that it means that we really do live in a world where there's no great answer to why me and not somebody else.
And the good news is both you and I agree on the most important things, which are one, that God can and does intervene at any point that he wants to, and two, that God will ultimately conquer all evil and win in the end. In fact, he really has already in Christ, but the ultimate revelation of that is yet to come, right? We're agreed on the most important parts of the story. God's in control. He loves us. He's good. And he will intervene on behalf of his people.
All right, one Bible verse. We're gonna weaponize Bible verses against each other at this point. If you want to look at one verse, and it's not maybe the best verse in the whole Bible for your case, but what's one verse you want people to think about when you think about your view of God's sovereignty in the world?
You know, to just summarize it to one is really tricky. For me, it goes back to that tension between free will and God's working in us, and it's that Philippians 2:13. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. It sounds so terrifying almost. Well, at the same time, it's incredibly comforting to hear that God is at work in you, and we're instructed to embrace both of those truths wholeheartedly. So I realize that that's a little different scenario. That's about sanctification, not your grandma just got hit by a car, but it's one verse that just so succinctly illustrates for me the tension that we're called to embrace. If you want to really go to scripture, go to Job. You got to read 42 chapters, but you got to tackle the whole book.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is so much more than just what one Bible verse can do. Dude, I thought you were going to pick Proverbs 16:33. I mean, just slam your Bible down and
mic drop.
And here's what it says: the lot is cast into the lap, but every decision is from the Lord. I mean, I just tried to say that chance is a real thing. I think that's a hard verse for me. I mean, that seems to be basically saying, like, look, you think you cast lots and things happen, but in reality, God decides everything. So I'll give that one to you.
So one is free will, one is chance. Either way, God's sovereignty is involved in either one.
Here's mine. I think you know what I'm going to go to. And this is the verse that for me, it's like, if God was trying to say that he's not responsible for evil in the world, I don't know how he could say it any more clearly than in Jeremiah 7:31. And he's talking about how his people have built these altars where they're sacrificing children. And he's looking at what they're doing. And this is God speaking. He says, I did not command it, nor did it even enter my mind that you would do this. And I'm picturing God just saying, like, do not blame me for the evil that you are doing in the world. It was not my call. I told you to do the opposite. And for me, it's like, I can't see how that fits with meticulous sovereignty, where God's saying, I did not command it, nor did it enter my mind, but I did actually decide that you were going to do it.
So can I really take you off? I actually agree with you that God is not responsible for evil.
There we go. We have to wrap up. Steve agrees with me now, and there you have it. So we actually do need to come to a close. We've gone way off the tracks. Let's bring it back. We're going to be in the book of Esther. You're going to be preaching this for us in just a little bit here. As people come to hear this message, as they get ready to have a small group discussion on this, what's one piece of advice that you would have for our people?
Well, it's a little brutal, actually. It's not something you typically hear from a pulpit. It's don't sugarcoat or deny what's happening in the world. And what's happening in the world, when you peel back a few layers, you don't have to peel back very far, is pretty dark and pretty wicked and pretty disheartening, at least at face value. So it will leave us begging for an answer to the question of where is God. But we can't just go right to the end of the book.
And what's so encouraging to me about that is that we don't have a Bible that ignores evil.
So good.
We don't have a Bible that's scared of the fact that there's really terrible things in the world. Governments, evil choices, sin, brokenness, all that. It takes it head on. And I think this is an invitation for us to think through that.
And I'm going to share a story on in the message that's very, very personal, more personal than anything I've shared so far, about when that really hit home for me. Because when it's personal, it's happening to somebody or to you, it takes on a whole different.
It's no longer an academic discussion at that point. Okay. Well, Steve, we look forward to that. Thank you for joining us. Awesome to have you, and I'm sure we'll do it again sometime soon.
Thank you.
All right. Well, there it is, the book of Esther, God's sovereignty, evil in the world. I hope that conversation was helpful to you. And I love my friend Steve. I love his mind and just the way that he thinks biblically, and I'm really looking forward to his message in Esther. So I hope you'll join us for that as we begin the Where is God series. So thank you for listening to First Look, and we will be back next week.